Hey all.
Hey,
Hey,
good to see you again. I know we're just reminiscing about wearing ties and suits in the office. I don't know if anyone else live with us had to do that earlier in their career, but we were just talking through all that fun stuff.
Yes, we might have a few. Yeah. Hi everyone. As you're joining, I'll let people join for a little bit. Feel free to say hi to us in the comments and maybe share where you're from. It's always fun to see. I think last time we had a few people from across the pond, which was pretty cool. So just pop in, say hi. Um, and yeah, we'll give you a few seconds to join. I'll do a few housekeeping items while we're waiting. So we will kind of kick off the conversation, and then really we welcome questions throughout. So if you have any questions as we're talking, just feel free to throw them in the comments. I'll keep my eye on the comments and I will pop them in as we get a chance. If we don't get to your question, please know that we'll get to it after the event. And then, reach out, connect to us. We will throw our email addresses in the final slide here. So, oh, wow. Texas,
Yeah,
DC, nice. A few Minneapolis, Minnesota, like it.
Seattle. All right.
We got all coasts. Hey, Connor. Hey, Grace.
Hey, Grace. Yeah.
It's a familiar face. Yeah, so I was thinking we could just kick things off with intros. I am the senior marketing manager here at Celarity. If you've been to these LinkedIn Lives before, you've probably seen me, so hi again. And then John, Carlos, if you want to introduce yourselves.
Carlos, you want to go first?
yeah, that sounds great. So thanks for having me today, Carlos Castellan. As Jamie mentioned, I'm also based in the Twin Cities, lead a team at the Navio Group. We work, so I come at this from a little bit more from the consulting perspective. We do a lot of work with retailers and consumer goods companies, but also kind of branch out to some other industries. So have, a little bit of a different vantage point probably from John's perspective. I'll let John do an intro and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I'm John. I'm one of the managing partners here at Celarity, and we do marketing, creative staffing, and recruiting. We do it across the country. We do have it's home base here basically in Minneapolis. But yeah, we work across the country in everything marketing and creative. So Carlos, I know you also do a lot of the consulting, mostly on the creative teams on these retail clients of yours, right?
Yeah, we do a bunch with some marketing organizations, oftentimes as well, kind of like supply chain operations teams, and then just general strategies you might imagine. So it kind of cuts across a lot of different teams. So, but yeah, to your point, definitely lots of work with marketing teams at these larger retailers or consumer goods companies.
Yeah, and it's always good to get your perspective because I know when we talk outside of these, live meetings in front of everybody, that you always have a good conversation with some of these leaders, like C-suite at some of these large corporations, about how they're setting up their teams, whether they're giving the work to agencies or internal agencies and how their workflows work. So it'd be awesome to get your perspective on this stuff for sure.
Yeah.
Terrific.
And that's kind of a great place to start. So I know there was a jobs report that recently came out that had a lot of great information that we'll cover. But I think everyone here could agree it's been kind of a weird year. It's a bit of a roller coaster. Some might say we're settling into like pre-COVID normal, or new normal, whatever that might be. But like John said, I think, Carlos, you are having a lot of conversations with those bigger organizations. And I'm curious what are those hiring conversations looking like at those companies in this moment?
Yeah, definitely. So I think going back to what you were saying, John, we are not seeing a return to work with like suits and ties. I think that is definitely not going to be going back, a reversion back to that. But I think, generally, Jamie, what I would say is, I think in general, for a lot of the clients that we talk to is, trying to be efficient with what they're doing. Really kind of a focus where the last couple of years was focused on growth and being high paced. I think this has been much more kind of like about simplification and being more efficient. And so what that translates into, from an organizational perspective is a lot of cases, kind of slowing down headcount. John and I were talking about this the other day, but a lot of this comes down to, headcount or hiring oftentimes is sort of happens, as people are reflecting growth trends and looking ahead. And so as sort of that growth has slowed down, I think for a lot of companies, it's been, okay, let's pump the brakes on hiring, kind of reassess what we need internally from an organizational perspective to be successful, and then getting a little bit more efficient and then being more kind of, I think, thoughtful and then purposeful in terms of how they might hire going forward and where they sort of invest energy and get behind. So that's kind of what we've seen, at least our end. It's sort of at a macro level across the company. I would say marketing is probably no different than that from what we've seen. John, I don't know what you think, if you've seen anything different. I know we've talked a little bit about this, but
yeah. So I mean, like what you're saying backs up a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing as well. Some of the numbers, I mean, the layoff numbers that I look at from the Fed has basically kind of got us at the level that we've been seeing historically as like a rate of layoffs. So they're definitely happening a lot more this year. I think just from a relative standpoint, like last year it was so historically low that now we're kind of back to the new normal, which I hate using those terms, but it definitely is kind of more of a normal level. Have you been seeing that too, Carlos, with your clients as far as like layoff levels and just like cutbacks in general from what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think, to your point too, is if you looked at, I haven't looked at like the numbers over the last couple of years, but I imagine if you looked at them, this year in comparison to the last couple of years, if you aggregated those total numbers from a layoffs perspective, it's probably very much in line, if not anything lower than what what's happened historically. So I think it's kind of like a little bit of right sizing for some of these organizations, which, I think we all probably on this have known folks that have gotten laid off, unfortunately, from jobs because it's all happened sort of at the same time, to some extent. So definitely I think it's occurred. And, at the same time, like a little bit of more, like we were talking about, just kind of being more purposeful in terms of hiring or being more efficient in some of these areas. And I think the other thing, to add to that, a lot of stuff that we end up talking with our clients about is now where there may have been a lot of competing priorities over the last couple of years, and especially just kind of like moving fast. Now it's been much more about, okay, how do we think about like what are our 3 to 5 priorities for the year and really get behind these and then try and move forward and whether that's from a hiring perspective, whether that's from a support and energy perspective. But I think a lot of just kind of focus on bringing it back to those like kind of key priorities for an organization.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what we're seeing too on our end, so we do quite a bit of work with large Fortune 500s here locally, and then we do a lot of perm placement stuff at mid-sized companies and ad agencies. I mean, from what I've been seeing for the last 6 months is a lot of the largest employers have been putting the most pause on things and layoffs, and outsourcing a lot to ad agencies too. Where I'm seeing the most hiring are ad agencies and mid-sized companies, especially like in manufacturing and some like special industries. But yeah, I saw a stat that kind of blew my mind that backed up exactly what we've been seeing from our clients. As of last month, we are at the highest employment level we've ever been for ad agency employment. The last peak was in 2001, so it's quite a long time ago. But yeah, ad agencies are seeing a huge increase of work, which probably backs up what you're saying, Carlos, about how these companies are getting work done and trying to be efficient while they try to figure out their long-term plans. Is that kind of what you're seeing too?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to, a lot of what you see historically in the space is when companies kind of buckle down and focus and prioritize on what they're doing internally, the stuff that's still critical, and marketing obviously is a critical function for any organization. Then it's okay, well, we're going to, maybe outsource this to, our creative agency or these other partners, and like making sure that we can still get the work done, but we're maybe working with our partners externally to manage some of that and get that done in an efficient manner, or be at least a little bit more focused. So I think that very much jives with what you're saying. And John, I know some of the stuff that you and I have talked about too is, as we think about like where outsourcing occurs, at least from where we sit, maybe a little bit more kind of like some of these fractional roles or some of these pieces where like support is needed. Oftentimes, like I know one of the things that's really been a big thing, not just this year, but I'd say over the last 5 years, is finance is like typically an area which is oftentimes needs a lot of support. So especially as you think about a lot of these organizations from like especially mid-sized controllers, finance folks, just a lot of this. And I think even on the controller and accounting side, like the complexity around tax law and all this stuff is like, it just requires a lot of effort to get your arms around it and make sure that from a company, you're sort of keeping with sort of best practices there. And then I think right after finance and that is marketing. That's like a typical area where people want some of this part-time support and expertise, especially in really kind of certain areas. So like on the digital side, which I know you all support. So these are places where specialization from a marketing perspective is really critical.
And that, I know you sent me the stuff from Catalent, which is a online workplace for consulting. you said that number 2 most requested was marketing roles, right? From a fractional leadership standpoint. So, and just so everyone knows, if they don't know the term fractional, it's basically like a part-time leader that's they have other clients as well, but they come in for a short period of time, usually to do projects, basically consulting more or less. But they're a little more embedded in the team. Um, so that's seen a lot of work, a lot of part-time freelancer type stuff too. We've been seeing pick up quite a bit. So, outsourcing like maybe 20 hours a week to a designer or a copywriter, things like that. And I know we have a couple comments about some stuff we mentioned about. So
Yes.
someone had a question about remote working positions. We did have some notes and we did talk about that. And mid-market. So mid-market is really like, I would say, companies between like, well, it depends on the kind of company too, because it could be a revenue versus company size. But people head wise, I'd probably put anything between like 50 and 100 employees, all the way up to like 1,000 employees would be like what I would consider the mid market. Is that kind of what you would agree with, Carlos?
Yeah, and as you probably imagine, John, I think the definition varies very widely from depending on what you're doing. So I think like the way I like to delineate it is there's sort of these large enterprises and maybe they're over $1 billion in revenue. And, oftentimes like these are getting to really large employers, but the mid-market is really wide. I mean, to your point, it could be 50, 100,000 employees, anywhere up to $1 billion in revenue. I think it's like a pretty large kind of size, but in general, the market over time, employment has moved more and more to the larger employers. But that mid-market is still really, really large.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other person had a question about the remote positions and the difficulty in finding that. Yes, they are very difficult right now. Some of the stats that we were seeing. So I think a vast majority of people applying to jobs on LinkedIn are most interested in remote jobs. And then when you consider that basically that means anybody in the country can apply for those. You're not just, competing with the people around your metro area or your town. You're now competing across the country, and it's also the most sought after type of positions. They're definitely seeing the most competition. Like I've talked to people searching right now that they see a job go live that's remote, and within a day or two, there's 500 applicants, and then they shut it off basically. So it is very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, just to give Catherine a little context, like you were saying, John, I think the stats are 66% of applications on LinkedIn are going to jobs that offer at least hybrid roles, but we're seeing only 10% of all job postings offer remote work, which is down from a peak of over 20%. So, I mean, obviously that was a few years ago, but those roles are becoming scarcer and scarcer quickly. So I don't know, any advice for people who are prioritizing that, or maybe are used to that or looking for that, and just aren't finding it?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, there's the common tips of making sure if you're applying for a job that you have the keywords in there. Because again, if you're going up against 500 people and you don't know the people at the company from a referral standpoint, it's just based on whatever the machine is picking out based on relevancy of keywords and how often those keywords are in your background and resume when you're applying. So it is a little bit of extra work. But if you are going up against that many people, you got to spend the time on that. And there is some tools out there that some AI tools I've heard some good stuff from, where if you put a job posting into it, it'll tell you what the main keywords are. And then you can even upload your resume too, and it'll give you suggestions on how to add more of it to show up. So that's like one tip. And we could try to find some of those resources afterwards and send them out as well.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't know, Carlos, do you have any tips too on that? It's definitely competitive. So it's tough.
Yeah, I know the three of us have talked a little bit about this. I think from where we sit and talking to sort of, C-level executives, I think most of the clients that we work with now have some sort of hybrid or return to work policy where people, I don't know that it's necessarily ever going to go back to 5 days a week in an office, but I think, oftentimes it's 2 to 3 days and they're asking employees to come in. And so I think that's sort of become the baseline norm for many companies now. And so those like full remote positions are really challenging. And as we think about, some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier in terms of companies getting more efficient, I think for better, for worse, a lot of folks see kind of coming into the office as a way to kind of shortcut any communication challenges, be more productive with the time that's being used. And so, as you think about this, if you're kind of searching for a job, I think being flexible to some of those positions that might be hybrid or in person, I think will be, I think important to just consider here going forward, because that is sort of where the focus for a lot of these companies is. And sort of how do you align to that, and so that you can put your best foot forward when you're thinking about finding a job. John, I don't know what the advice you kind of give to folks, especially as you're doing hiring, but that's what I would say.
Well, one thing I just would back up is that if you're able on LinkedIn to see if have a connection there with somebody or somebody that went to the same school as you, I think they offer all of that stuff on LinkedIn if there's any sort of connection there. I'd say don't be afraid to put your sales hat on and reach out to those people and just check in on the role and see if they can help you out in any way. The more specific you can be with what you're looking for help, the more helpful people will be. If you're saying like, hey, this job I think I'm a really good fit for, I was hoping maybe you could shed some light on, who the right contact would be for me, or if you could maybe give me some tips on how best to, apply or stand out. Most people are pretty open to helping, but you just got to be really specific with what the ask is. Because it's hard to help somebody if you're not really sure exactly what they need. So just anything you do to make that ask easier, I would recommend.
John,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I talked to someone yesterday that was looking for a job for a couple months. And what he told me was, he, exactly to your point, got really specific around the types of roles he was looking for, and had actually an initial interview with a company. The company said, hey, like, your background is great. We're looking for someone maybe with a little bit more experience. And he just kind of kept following up with them every couple of weeks and ended up getting the job with them just because, at the end of the day, he was sort of like the best qualified candidate for them. They ended up kind of being flexible to do it. So I think to your point, kind of speaks to like being really clear about the types of roles you want to go after, the employers. And I think, that follow-up piece and the sales piece is really critical to some of these things.
That's a really good point, Carlos. I actually heard from a couple people on that with how, and this might touch on a few of the comments I saw come through. May and April and March were all pretty slow, especially from what we saw on our end too. And a lot of companies were kind of just hesitant in general about hiring or not. If you interviewed or talked to any of those companies the last few months as you've been searching, I would always check back in, because to Carlos's story there, I mean, things have been different for the last couple of weeks that I've noticed. And someone said they noticed they saw quite a few more jobs come open in graphic design, I think. That is exactly how we felt too the last 2 weeks. We've seen an uptick in requests from clients. We hope it's a trend that continues, and it's been a really encouraging past 2 weeks. So what you're seeing, Maria, is the same thing that we're seeing. So hopefully that continues. I think from like a market standpoint, Carlos and Jamie, you can back this up from what you're seeing, but it does seem like there's a more stability of like what to expect for the midterm for companies planning at this point. And it sounds like people are more open to hiring and like kind of pushing forward with these initiatives. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I mean, I think there's a little bit more clarity in terms of what to expect. At this point, there's like, if you're sitting in the decision maker shoes, a little more data, and like a little less certainty, maybe just around interest rates and growth and those sort of pieces. And so I think it's, okay, we've kind of gone through this initial piece, like how do we continue to move forward in the current environment? So totally agree with you. I think that's, and hopefully that's sort of like a harbinger here for like the next couple months and like going forward in terms of we've settled into this, to use the cliche, the new normal. And like, we now know what this is. And so, we can make some decisions around that going forward.
Yeah. And, you kind of mentioned it, but like with inflation slowing down, and it seems like wage growth, at least the wage growth we've seen over the last year plus, also seems to be slowing down. Anecdotally, are you seeing that? Is that something that's happening really rapidly? Are you also seeing, job seekers and their expectations aligning with the companies that are hiring, and where's that, or if that's a struggle? Just curious what you both are seeing.
Yeah, I can throw my 2 cents in that, James. It's a great question. The last 2 years were some of the craziest years I can ever remember as far as that stuff. Like people were throwing out 10, 20% raises for switching jobs or retaining people. We're not seeing that anymore. There's definitely like an increase, but it's more like, I'd say like between 2 and 5% at this point, which is, again, a new normal. that we're kind of used to seeing in the past. And I did see an interesting survey last week about that, and like people who are currently staying in companies and what they're seeing as far as like a yearly increase in their comp. And most people are seeing from their employers 2 to 4% this last year, which stinks because we all know inflation in the last year or so has been like pretty high. So it was not keeping up with that. But we are seeing things kind of come back in line with those numbers. And I don't know, Carlos, if you have anything extra on that, but that's just what we've been seeing on our end.
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the inflation data from where we sit like probably lags what is being seen in the market. But I think a lot of times, and I know, John, one of the things that you and I have talked about is like regionally so different in this country in terms of what we see from inflation. I know here in the Twin Cities, it's closer now to 2% than a lot of other parts of the country. So I think that's like one variable to throw in here. But from where we sit, like I think the inflation definitely seems to be coming down. And I think that's partly reflected in like the lower growth numbers, sales growth numbers for a lot of these companies as well. So I would anticipate that continues. And then we kind of get back to this period. Exactly what you were saying is like, I think the 2 to 4% was like pretty standard pre-pandemic, from a raise perspective every year. So, I think that's kind of hopefully coming back into line, with sort of the historical norms, but also I would expect that sort of inflation numbers as well, kind of, while not being a macroeconomist, from what we see, it seems very similar, and especially with the economy being so driven by consumer consumption.
What are you both seeing? Are you seeing any sort of reaction in hiring strategies in response to like emerging tech? Obviously, AI, ChatGPT is a big one. Is that being felt already, or are people still like not sure about it, not really using it to inform their strategies? What are you guys seeing?
I can tell you just from some stats I saw. I think over half of companies are putting some of these tools into place in their HR teams. And I can say, from talking to people, it's been some of the more, and some people who've gone through, layoffs many times in their careers over the last 10, 15, 20 years. This time, it seems like the most frustrating experience that I've been hearing from people. There's some executives I've talked to that they haven't even heard back from companies when they apply. One person I remember I talked to who's based in the East Coast, so he's been applying for jobs and reaching out since March, and like has not even gotten an interview. So I think a lot of these tools, and I'm a little bit worried about maybe how they're being implemented, that they're kind of taking the human out of human resources and just not following up with people. That is, I think, a terrible kind of strategy, even though it might save you time and money. I think that's going to leave a pretty bitter taste from a lot of people's mouths for how they're treated when they're applying for jobs. And I don't think it's a good long-term strategy, but that's kind of what I've been picking up on, is some of those tools on that front are really just kind of frustrating people from what I'm hearing from people.
I can't speak to it as much, John, from the HR perspective. I think you'd have you have probably better perspective than I do. I would say, like, more broadly, a lot of these tools, I think companies are excited about the potential, not quite sure how to implement them yet. And I know, at least for a lot of the clients that we talk to, there's like questions around data privacy. It's like, hey, if you're sharing your information with ChatGPT, and we also have competitors doing the same thing, like, gets to be a little bit messy. And so I think that in general, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for it early on. And right now, like some of the clients we talk to, it's like, the legal and compliance departments are like, hey, let's pump the brakes and like, let's figure out how we actually do something here around this. But I know, some of the stuff that you and I have talked about, John, especially for job seekers, is really having an understanding perhaps of like how some of these tools are starting to enter this space. And then you as a candidate can kind of communicate some of that value to potential employers or your current employer in terms of where there's, opportunity for automation or efficiency improvements, because that largely kind of runs into some of the discussion that we talked about earlier about like just being more productive, which is where companies are focused. So to the extent that you can bring that perspective into these conversations, I think that's a helpful thing to bring along.
Yeah, because the majority of the people we talk to, teams on marketing and creative, like they are figuring out how they're going to use these tools. So it's definitely happening. But to Carlos's point, I think it's been slowing down a little bit just because they need to get legal involved as far as like what's copyrightable and what's not. And also with the image generations, like, is this stuff that we can actually use? I know Adobe's taking a good route on it and making sure that people feel comfortable that they can use what they come up with on that front. But yeah, it's a lot of change, and people are trying to figure it out. But yeah, always stay up to date on these tools. And thanks, Chris. I see you. The job scan tool is the one I was kind of trying to remember. So everyone should check that out if you're job searching. There's a bunch of them out there, but job scan is one of them that could help you kind of update your resume with keywords.
I think somebody also mentioned Teal is great for keyword matching.
Okay.
I haven't used that one.
I don't know that one either, but that's great. If anybody has any other recommendations, throw them in the chat, because definitely other people would be interested in seeing those too. But yeah, there's tools to use for your job search. There's tools to use for your job and marketing. I always stay up to date on that stuff for sure, because you're going to have those skills.
What's this one? Yeah, and let's see. I kind of want to take a step back. I know we mentioned at the beginning that the jobs report that just came out, and I think, John, you had brought up how there was just such an interesting rise in the unemployment rate alongside the number of jobs being posted. So both of those are kind of going up, and I was curious what both of you think might be behind this. It's kind of a unique situation, and might point to kind of where we find ourselves here today in the current job market. So yeah, just curious what the why behind it.
Sure. Carlos, you want to go first on this one, or you want me to go first?
Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, we have two working theories on it. And again, we're not, we don't know everything at all. But two working theories. So the number of jobs added was increased 330,000 or something like that. And then another Bureau of Labor report that's people working decreased. So it's really conflicting numbers. You would think that would be aligned. So we have two theories on that. One is some people who might have been independent workers are taking jobs, and that would be some of that work. And then also they're looking for work at the same time, because that would show up in that data. And then the other interesting thing, if there was, there is an uptick in layoffs, people might not have been claiming unemployment yet and taking new jobs. So that could be not reflected in the lost jobs, but yet jobs increasing. It's just very spaghetti and messy. And usually when they revise this stuff in a couple months, it'll make a lot more sense. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing that stuck out to me. And I don't know if you have anything else to add, Carlos, on that front.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's hard. There's a lot, some of these numbers, I think there's lagging data sometimes. So to your point, I think you have a better handle on it going forward a couple of months and looking backwards when there's revisions and these sort of things. That's kind of what we were talking about earlier with inflation. I think same thing here. I don't think it's necessarily, the inflation report is usually I think a month behind anyway. So it's if you're looking at it today, it's very different than what will be reported, and things are changing very quickly. So yeah, hard to read into it. I think it's much more about what we've talked about is the things that we're seeing in talking to clients and on the ground is kind of how we've at least informed our opinion on some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Cool.
That probably didn't clear up much, but
yeah,
a little color to the numbers at least.
Yeah.
Anything else trend-wise we wanted to cover?
Are there any questions from the here?
Yeah.
There's one that says, I haven't heard back from companies after applying. I haven't heard back from recruitment agencies after going through the interview process. What is your take on this? So one quick thing I'll say on this, I know, John, you and I have talked about this. At a lot of these companies, the recruiting function has been, unfortunately, kind of one of the first groups to go from a layoff perspective because there's been less hiring. So, I think those teams have been stretched a little bit more thin. And so I think as you think about, if you're searching for jobs, working with someone like Celarity, I think is really great. Some of these intermediaries that are, these companies are relying on to do recruiting, I think is really helpful. And then obviously, I think there's, to your point earlier, there's always sort of this piece of finding direct connections at some of these companies, especially where you're really kind of passionate or want to work. And I think there's no real substitute for that. I think having that that human connection really makes a difference, and also shows kind of the interest that you might have in that particular company.
Yeah, and to back up that experience that you're dealing with, Catherine, one of the departments that we've been seeing is most impacted by layoffs is HR. So they are experiencing probably the most thinning on their teams, which means they probably don't have as much availability to go back to what we were talking about to follow up with everybody. And on the recruitment agency side, I know that, like our company, for instance, we'll try to talk to as many people as possible, kind of get what you're looking for, your search and stuff. But also, if we're not seeing the roles coming through like you're not seeing, we may not have much to reach out back on. We don't have anything. So that might be part of that experience too. But like somebody mentioned, and like what we're seeing, the last 2 weeks have been really encouraging. So we'd hope to see that stuff continue for sure.
Yep. I think that's a great point. And I know, we're coming up on time here, so I want to be mindful of that. But obviously we do these every quarter. So this is a great place to kind of come together and have questions answered. But if there are any resources, John, Carlos, that you guys keep kind of your finger on the pulse of these things. I know, John, you mentioned the jobs report. Just if you could share those before we say our final goodbyes with people in case, in the interim, they want to check things out and look at the data themselves.
Yeah, I would just leave it with, there's a bunch of sites you can go to, a bunch of resources. If you want to keep things simple, I know LinkedIn does there's an area in LinkedIn that does their trend reports. And most of the people I think are on here are probably marketing creative, or at least like professional services type level or jobs. That's what LinkedIn's for. And their trend reports are going to be probably your best bet as far as like looking to see what's going on out there. So I'd recommend checking out that if you're trying to, keep up with what the trends are. Carlos, do you have any suggestions?
I think the only two things, probably less on like the technical and tool side is, I've talked to a bunch of folks looking for sort of roles here in the last couple of months. So I'd say kind of three things is one, being flexible in terms of the remote versus the hybrid pieces. If it's important to you, to find a job, especially that you're with a particular company or in a specific role, I think being flexible with that, and even potentially like if you have to move to do that. Like I know that was like something I've seen pre-pandemic that a lot of people did. I think that's starting to trend back a little bit that direction to find the right opportunity. So I'd say the kind of being flexible on that side of things is number one. I think number two would be to just be kind of, I think, clear in terms of kind of connecting a little bit to the role, the company that you want to work for, and having like a really good why behind some of this stuff, and having like the clear story as you get into the interview pieces. I think really important, as I talk to folks, it's like, there's a lot of times, hey, I want to find a new role, but not always sort of that clarity around what that is or what the company is and what those opportunities look like from a career perspective. And then I think three, kind of moving kind of a little bit upwards, but in terms of the resume and those pieces, like really focusing on outcomes and results that you drove in past roles and those sort of things. And so to the extent that you can add numbers and quantify some of that, I think really important to do that to even get to that interview piece. And so kind of taking the time to go through that, talking to people and have that review, I think is really important so that it's, quantifiable and measurable for people to understand that impact if they're looking at you as a candidate.
Carlos, I think we need to pull you into recruiting here. That was a pretty good one.
It's the basics, right? It's always going back to the basics.
Yeah. And just one more thing to hit on, Maria. I see your comments there about replying directly or working with recruiters. I always recommend working with multiple recruiting agencies. I would just be a little careful about how many you work with, because there might be some crossover on the roles that we work on. But the reason why I recommend at least two to talk to, we don't all see the same roles. So I would recommend, working with a couple different groups, ones that you connect with, have the conversation with them. And then, applying directly, I'd say I always go direct if you can. Recruiters, we're here to help too. But, if you do talk to a recruiter about a role and then go to direct, I would not recommend that, because there's a cross that could happen, and it doesn't look good on anyone's part if there's like a cross submittal. So I'd just be cautious on that. Make sure that you get confirmation from a recruiter if they actually sent your information over or not. They should be able to tell you that pretty quickly about a role. So make sure about that. Like, just get confirmation from anyone you're working with about what they're sending you for.
Yeah. That's good advice. Yeah, and if we didn't get to your question, we'll pop into the comments. We'll answer. Like I said, we'll throw up our emails. But if you're not connected with all of us on LinkedIn, please do. And thank you for joining. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, John. I hope you all have a happy Thursday. And if it's sunny where you are, go get some sun. Talk to you guys later.
Thanks, everyone.